Now that my daughter is nearly 16, she thinks she's adult enough to stay in the house alone for short periods of time, and I'm hesitant to share my reasons as to why I'm just not comfortable. Because I said so isn't a phrase I like to use often, but I contemplated it on this instance alone. Because what my daughter doesn't know is that I was just like her, except I was 15. The only difference is that once I got a chance to do it, I never wanted to do it again. I was 15 when my parents had to go to my grandmother's house one night. I will say it was unexpected, and if it wasn't, I would have never been left alone. However, my grandmother was getting up in age and it was an emergency, so my parents rushed out of the door. I had school the next day, so I took the opportunity to beg my parents to let me stay home this one time as a trial run. I promised that if it didn't go according to plan, I would never ask again. To my shock, they fell for it. They left right before the sun went down for the evening, and I waved from the window through the curtains, like every movie scene ever. As soon as I locked the door behind them, my brain began to race with the possibilities of what I could do now. I couldn't slow the thoughts down long enough to even process them. I started by going upstairs and running a scorching hot bath in my mom's clawfoot bathtub. I remember my mom begging my dad for it, and since we had it, I had been allowed in it only 3 times. It was her pride and joy. I raced up the steps as fast as my legs would allow. I ran the water as hot as I could physically stand, snagged a bath oil that smelled nice to me, and allowed myself to sink into the heat. My muscles seemed to melt in seconds. I let out a pleasing groan and closed my eyes. I let my mind be lulled by the sloshing of the water. I sat there in bliss, feeling like nothing could pull me out of my reverie, but something did. I had my body submerged to where only my face remained out of the water when I heard something that sounded like a door closing on the first floor. Since my ears were still underwater, it didn't sound clear. It caused more of an echo. I lifted myself out of the water and sat as still as I could. I was trying to focus on the sounds to see if I could find anything unfamiliar, but by the time I was focused, everything was back to the silent stillness from before. Shrugging it off, I finished soaking and got out of the water. I towel-dried myself to the sound of classic country that was coming from the living room downstairs. I was enjoying myself until I got hit with the epiphany that 1. I didn't like country. 2. I didn't leave anything on downstairs. Dread began to clutch at the back of my mind. Rationally, I knew that I should probably call someone. Irrationally, I knew that calling someone would completely destroy any chance of staying alone again. You can imagine what decision my dumb teenage brain made. Honestly, looking back, I'm shocked I lived to be an adult. I managed to gather my overinflated confidence and remind myself that I wasn't scared. This was my home. Resolute in my own mantra, I walked back down to the main room of the house. I tried to avoid letting myself exhibit the body language of someone who's terrified. I tiptoed through the rooms, one by one, until I came to the last one. I took one deep inhale before I reached and threw the door wide open. I nearly fell when I tried to land the jump that noise caused me to do. I let out a string of expletives when I saw that it wasn't an intruder who caused the banging. It was me. I swung the door hard enough that it knocked a picture off the wall behind the door. I felt shame rush up my neck. I had even convinced myself that I cut the music on myself too, even if I knew it was utterly impossible. More annoyed at my own stupidity, I walked to the living room and flipped the music off. When silence fell, I took every snack I could find to the sofa and clicked the remote on. I flipped through the channels of infomercials and awful reality television before I hit the sci-fi channel. It was a scene I knew well from a movie called House on Haunted Hill, the remade version. I settled in for an all-nighter with a pile of snacks and scary movies, determined to make the most of the night. I must have gotten comfortable or was sleepier than I imagined, because when I was lucid again, the clock read 2 a.m. Not only that, I now had a Sherpa throw tossed over my body. The television was also off, and I was clutching a pack of Oreos. As confused as I was, I searched for any memory of maybe covering myself up. It wasn't there. I barely remembered falling asleep or even being drowsy. I reached my hand up above my head to reach the string that would click a table lamp on. Once things were illuminated, I knew I hadn't covered myself up. The remote control was placed in an almost perfect straight line on the entertainment center. A chair that sat at our desk was pulled out and sat with it facing the couch, and a rocks glass set on the floor in front of it. The scene before me led me to an unsettling opinion that someone had been watching me sleep from the chair. Upon a closer look, the rocks glass looked unused. I quickly reached for a phone to call my parents. This was back when house phones were a thing, and I used it to dial my parents' cell. It did nothing but ring and then hung up. I couldn't even leave a message due to the voicemail being full. I slammed down the home phone and turned on every light that was in the main floor. I didn't care that my parents would lecture me on a power bill. It wasn't until a few hours later that I heard something again, this time from the back of the house. It sounded like a ball bouncing off a wall. I didn't waste time and ran toward the noise to see if I could figure out what it was, and I saw what it was. A dark figure fled from the front door as soon as I went to the back. A ball sat in the corner of the room. I only saw the figure because I caught a glimpse of movement from the side. This time I called the police. I knew I couldn't convince myself it was anything else. Thankfully, cops responded within 6 minutes. They did the normal procedures, including searching around the house, inside, and took down my statement. After they assured me nobody was there and made a call to my parents, they left. I sat vigilantly on the couch while I waited for my parents to make it back. When a knock came at the front door, I thought it was odd that my parents would bother. I thought a second before walking to the door. I guess whoever was on the other side saw movement and spoke softly through the wood. He let me know that his name was Joey, and he moved in across the street from us and saw police cars. He was just checking to see if things were okay. The people showed a boy about my age. He wore rimmed glasses and seemed very non-threatening. I cracked the door before stepping outside. Remembering what I had been taught from crime shows, when he asked where my parents were, I ignored his question. I told him that if I needed anything that I would run over if I felt unsafe, but for now it was okay. I was okay. We left it at a cordial goodbye, and I watched as he walked away. Looking down, I saw a set of black steel-toed boots. It felt a fleeting moment of recognition before closing and locking the door once again. My parents came home shortly after he left, and I had never been so excited to have them home. When I told my mom what happened and explained that our new neighbor's son had stopped by to see if I was safe, I saw confusion on both faces. My dad looked at me as if I had lost my mind, and put his hands on my shoulder before informing me that we didn't have new neighbors. I remember when I would hear people talk about these unbelievable events that they witnessed. I would roll my eyes and mentally check myself out. I've always been skeptical about tall tales, so when I finally experienced something for myself, I felt instant regret for doubting everyone else. This happened when I was 22. My mother had gotten me a job at a hospital where she worked in billing. She was friends with the manager of death records. I wish I could tell you that I lasted there for a while and was excellent at my job, but I can't say that or I'd be lying. In fact, I lasted a single overnight shift before I decided it wasn't for me. I used to think that I'd enjoy it and even joked that at least the people I dealt with wouldn't be able to talk back, and if they did, they were in the wrong department. I learned soon enough that I could handle entitled customers rather well when given the two choices. Being young and absolutely idiotic, the night before I was scheduled to start, I went out with friends. I wasn't planning to drink too much, and I figured if I limited my intake, I'd be fine after I slept it off in time to go to work that next night. One thing led to another, one beer turned to 5, and then I'm waking up on my sofa still wearing the clothes from last night. Not to mention my head was swimming in alcohol. Even figuring out how to be a human was difficult, but I sucked it up and started the process of getting up. The first thing that I had to do was get out of these clothes. After I washed off what was left of last night's hangover, I felt 10 times better. Enough so that before my shift, I stopped to get Red Bulls just in case I started to get drowsy while there. It didn't take long to navigate the hospital. Once you walked into the main entrance, you would walk into an atrium that houses several shops. I breezed right by those and headed towards a back hallway that had an elevator that went down to our basement level, an area that only employees could access. Considering it was death records, we were naturally down where our autopsy auditorium, pathology lab, and morgue. Since I was the only one working on a night shift in the records area, I knew that it was unlikely I would have anyone to keep me company. The autopsy auditorium was kept locked at night along with the pathology lab. The first thing I noticed as I made my way towards the office I would be in was that it smelled sterile. It was like I sniffed Germ-X. The next thing that hit was the temperature. I was shivering. I looked at the tote that held a scrub jacket and silently thanked my mom for worrying. As I entered, I flipped the light on and headed towards a desk that held several folders scattered on top. Orientation gave me a little preview of what to expect, so I wasn't nervous. Besides, the little post-it note told me that they filled most of the charts and told me I could learn the system in the downtime. I set my things under the desk and slid into the uncomfortable chair, spinning myself in a half circle to take it all in. Finally, when all the excitement had time to settle, I set myself up and started to look over the computer system. I clicked on the tabs and icons until my eyes burned, eventually moving back from the desk to grab a handbook they gave on the first day. While it didn't feel great on my eyes either, at least it wasn't bright. I could feel my eyes starting to burn and I couldn't fight the urge to yawn. With eyes still stinging, I leaned myself back in the chair a few inches and closed my eyes. I wasn't intending to go to sleep. I just kind of got comfortable, and even with the Red Bull, it happened. I jerked my body upright when my eyelids opened and I registered that I had been asleep. I remember looking around to see if I could find cameras, which I couldn't, but that didn't mean they weren't there. Rubbing my eyes, I tried to regain my focus. It was right as I looked back up that I noticed the door that led from our office into the morgue section was ajar. Not just slightly, but completely open. My eyes darted back and forth looking for the visitor that very clearly walked by during my snooze. Nobody. Nothing. There wasn't even a light on anymore. Slightly unnerved, I stood up to close the door. I pushed until I heard the click. Then, I walked back past my desk to the bathroom. Something else stood out. The bathroom lacked the usual sterile scent. The smell that lingered throughout the rest of the office was absent. It was replaced by a sickly scent of bourbon and cedar. It reminded me of a man's beard oil. Weird? Sure. I scanned for an air freshener to no avail. I ignored the strange feeling and did my business, exiting after washing my hands. Back at the desk, I had a strange feeling that I wasn't alone. I didn't see anything, but it still felt crowded. I constantly felt like someone was lurking in the shadows behind me. It didn't matter that I was in a secured building. I just didn't feel entirely safe. During a break, I just scrolled down my Facebook feed and I heard a clink from the far side of the room, by the door that led back out to a main room. My eyes stayed locked into where I heard the noise, and slowly, as in slow motion, I watched as a test vial fell from a shelf and pinged on the floor. Beside it sat another of the same. Then, from the main hallway, a beep from the door scanner was barely audible. I stood up, knocking the chair back. It was still too early for others to be in the rooms, and I knew that if it was someone who was supposed to be there, they would always pop their head in to let us know. Even the head lead for records told me that. It was to let the person in here know not to panic if they heard something. I was full-on nervous breakdown mode by then. I couldn't seem to stop imagining a masked figure holding rib cutters. Still, it freaks me out when I remember it. I tried to think of a way to see if someone was in the other office without it being obvious, and I looked for the extension numbers in the desk. My thought was I could call, and if someone answered, then great. If not, then it would be reason to worry. I picked up the phone with shaking hands and dialed 761. I held my breath as I waited for the line to ring. I didn't know which one I wanted to happen more, an answer or no answer. The phone rang once, twice, before it stopped. I held it up to my ear and squeaked a hello. Instead of a response, I heard breathing and then the dial tone. Slamming the phone down, I started to rifle through the mess of chaos on the top of the desk. I had sat my cell phone down just minutes before, but now it was gone. I remembered setting it down on the side of the desk, but after 2 minutes of scavenging without luck, I slammed my hands down on the top. My hands were left stinging. I knew I put it down there. I remembered because I nearly dropped it onto the floor. I wanted out. I ended up pacing in circles. It was during that circle that I found the battery of my cell phone on top of the filing cabinet. The actual phone was tucked in a vacant drawer's desk. I ended up leaving that shift right then. I didn't even clock out. Was it unprofessional? Yes. Do I care? Not really. I wanted out. I sent an email to the manager. Then I followed it up with leaving a voicemail for the person that was my relief. I left and I never looked back. I never asked what happened or even tried to find out. I was just happy to never deal with it again. When me and my husband started dating, he was trying to work towards becoming a preacher. He had grown up in a strict religious household, and ever since he was a teenager, this was his dream. Well, he wanted to be a youth pastor. Now, he was on his way to reaching that goal. Obviously, with him being into religion and his upbringing, we didn't stay together before marriage. At all. I'm talking no sleepovers, no late-night stays, no sex, nothing. He was always out of my presence by midnight. Some people thought it was weird, but I found it sort of sweet, in a way. After 2 years, we tied the knot and moved in together right after the wedding. Well, technically before, but he never slept at our home with me until after our honeymoon vacation. As you can imagine, living together was a giant learning curve for both of us. The first few weeks we were constantly tripping over each other at every turn. I didn't like how he folded clothes, he didn't like how I made the bed. Know what I know now, I would opt to live with someone before marriage. It would be nice to know what they did that drove me crazy. I think the oddest and most unsettling thing that happened, though, was definitely 3 weeks in. Me and my husband had both went to bed at the same time. He did his nighttime devotionals, his Bible study, prayed, and then settled into the blankets. I finished a few chapters and followed right behind him. Right as I was drifting into a sleep, I felt his breathing even out and turn into low hums of satisfaction. I wrapped my body around his and closed my eyes. It wasn't until I felt the bed shift underneath me that I opened my eyes once more. Suddenly, the bed was empty except for me. The mattress still held his body's indention. I reached an arm out to be met with a still warm spot. I rubbed my eyes when I sat up, looking to see if he stepped into the bathroom. He wasn't there. I clicked on the side lamp and swung my legs out of the bed, slipping my feet into Sherpa slippers. I didn't even make it out of my bedroom when I heard banging coming from the floor below. I picked up the pace as I raced down the stairs to the foyer, skidding to a halt. At the bottom, everything was still dark. The only light came from a little nightlight that was in the downstairs bathroom. Once more, the clanging. I debated if I wanted to find out what was causing it, but I knew that if my husband was in trouble that I would have to help. I would never forgive myself if I didn't. I walked my way towards the kitchen and my foot hit something cold. It was a pan that was put in 5 hours earlier. I felt towards the light switch and clicked it. I was shown more pots and pans. There were even giant spoons scattered around. Confused but not worried, I finally walked into the kitchen. In the corner was my husband, clad in boxers. He wasn't facing me though. His nose was pressed firmly into the corner of the wall. Even his toes were touching the baseboard. I stood there confused for a few minutes until I took a few steps toward him. I didn't know what to do since it wasn't like this happened nightly. I reached my hand out to try to touch his shoulder, but when my fingers barely grazed his skin, I heard him emit some noise. It wasn't anything I had even heard before. It wasn't a moan, but it wasn't words. It seemed like a growl. I snatched my hand back before stepping away. When he turned my way, I couldn't help but cower. His eyes seemed blank. Lights were on, but nobody was home, or something like that. His whole iris looked like a giant pupil. It was like a dark abyss of nothingness. I couldn't keep my eyes locked on him without feeling like he was burning a hole through me. I was about to try to reach one more time until he started babbling. At first listen, it seemed like gibberish or a made-up language, but after he repeated the same line several times, I caught on to what he was saying. Jehovah Jireh. Considering that I wasn't as deep in faith as my husband, I had no clue what those words actually entailed, but he kept repeating them. The growling noises continued as it grew louder as he went. I felt like he was looking through everything. He was seeing something that I didn't see. It was eerie. All at once his growling and chants stopped. He stood as still as a statue before moving closer to me. With his face inches away from mine, he whispered, "We will both burn." My throat had a lump the size of a baseball in it. I couldn't breathe, and my mouth had gone dry. "Don't say that." He turned his face into a demented smile and giggled as if he were a child. I hadn't wanted to wake him, but I didn't know what else to do. I had been told that waking a sleepwalker was frowned upon. I tried to rein in my fear and approached him carefully as if he were a rabid dog. "We are all going to burn. I'm going to make us burn." I stared at my husband as if he were a stranger. It was like looking at a silhouette of someone that I used to know. He wasn't acknowledging me as his wife anymore. It was during that brief pause that his body completely reared itself back before lunging at me with his arms in front of him. If it wasn't for me taking a mini step to the left, he would have grabbed my shoulders. Instead, my movement sent him toppling forward, hitting his hands on the kitchen island. He rebounded with a look of rage, screaming at me. I didn't know what to do, so I ran upstairs. The entire time I was trying to remind him of where he was or who I was, but it wasn't working. It was like he was a stranger. Once I made it upstairs, I locked myself in the bedroom, pushing a nearby bookcase to block the door. It felt like hours passed with him beating at the door. He was rambling on about burning and Yahweh. Then, at other times, it sounded like a made-up language. I contemplated calling the cops, but if he was actually asleep, then I didn't want him to end up with a charge or something worse. All at once, he stopped. It sounded as if he just vanished. I couldn't even hear his footsteps outside the door. I didn't feel comfortable enough to open the door yet, though. I kept my hand on the doorknob for several minutes, ear pressed to the wood. After straining to hear anything, I heard sobbing. Not light sobs, actual hard sobs. He was almost hyperventilating from what I could hear. When I slowly pushed the bookcase over and opened the door, the crying grew louder. I scanned the hall for where my husband went and found him sitting in the corner hugging himself. His face was pressed into his knees as if he were a small child. Suddenly, I was no longer afraid. I felt bad for him. I went to him and crouched down to his level, and he reached his arms out, holding on to me as if I was going to evaporate from his grip. He continued to cry, talking about how we were both going to burn in hell for our transgressions. I had run out of words, so I simply tried to help him up and escorted him back to our bed. I managed to have him lay down, and within seconds he was back asleep. I don't think I slept a wink that night. I kept replaying his words. What was worse was that the next morning he didn't remember anything. He thought I was kidding. I don't think he even thinks that I'm serious several years later.